This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Josh Blackman his incredibly timely book, Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty and Executive Power. Josh Blackman is an associate professor at the Houston College of Law. He is the author of the previous book, Unprecedented, The Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare. He has been published in numerous law review articles, law review journals. He has also been published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, among other publications, and was named by Forbes magazine as 30 under 30 in law and policy. He's also a frequent blogger. He blogs at joshblackman.com. Josh, welcome to the program.
Richard, a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I really love this quote you have on the opening page of the book, the prologue. You quote Barack Obama in sort of a riposte he offered to those in Congress who were not fully funding Obamacare or threatening to withhold funds in Obamacare. And I believe this, maybe the date, help me out, was fall 2013, some around in there. And Barack Obama, in response to this challenge, said they should, quote, they should not seek to, quote, unravel what has now been woven into the fabric of America. Josh, has Obamacare been woven into the fabric of America, in your judgment, given you are perhaps more than anyone else in conservatism, classical liberalism, no one maybe has more knowledge than you of the statute, of all that it's meant. So I think your judgment here is particularly apt.
Well, I thank you very much for the opportunity. And I do have to confess, I chose the title Unraveled before President Obama made that statement. And when he said, I'm like, wow, perfect for my book. So the short answer is portions of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare have been woven into the American culture. That was the president's victory in 2010 by passing the law in the manner which he did. And the portions that have been woven are this sense of entitlement that everyone who wants to buy insurance should be able to buy insurance, that insurers can't charge more money for sick people. Those sentiments have been instilled in Americans, and I don't think it's impossible to remove them. Unfortunately, President Obama lied about the cost of doing so. He promised nearly 36 times that if you like your policy, you can keep your policy. So people were under this false sense of security that we can simultaneously give insurance to 20 million people while keeping it exactly the same for everyone else. Now, listeners of this podcast who have even the most basic understanding of economics will realize that is impossible. That in order to pay for these older and sicker people to have insurance, it's going to make everything else expensive for others. And guess what? You're not going to be able to keep the policy you like. So we're in this worst of both worlds where this entitlement mentality has been woven into the fabric of this country, but at the same time, the sense that we can do this so that any personal injury has also been woven in. So we have the worst of both worlds. People think we can be nice to others without hurting ourselves. You can't do both at the same time. I think that's one of the most dangerous things Barack Obama has done by trying to convince Americans of these two simultaneous inconsistencies, these contradictions.
So what are, if we think about Obamacare unraveling, and as you know, I mean, many stories coming out, really for the past 2 years since, as you just mentioned, people with individualized health plans started having them canceled and then had to opt for an Obamacare plan. So we just had a huge election, to put it mildly. The challenges faced by those in the new administration and the Congress, presumably I hear there's a repeal plan or a plan for a new, some sort of healthcare plan. What are the challenges that they face in trying to do that?
The biggest challenge faced with any sort of repeal is the Democrats, and I don't mean that lightly. So long as a filibuster remains in place in the Senate, it will be physically impossible to get over the 60 vote threshold to repeal it. Now, I actually have a piece coming out in National Review, and by the time this airs, it will be published, discussing a blueprint about how Obamacare can be repealed. And there's a couple options. The first option relies on something called the budget reconciliation approach. In 2010, when Obamacare was enacted, you may recall that Senator Scott Brown, a Republican Tea Partier from Massachusetts, won a special election. And with that, the Democrats lost their 60th vote in the Senate and a filibuster-proof majority. What happened? House Speaker Nancy Pelosi decided, well, if we send this bill back to the Senate, it's going to be filibustered. So instead, they used something called the budget reconciliation process, which allows the Senate to vote on something without a filibuster. The cost of that, though, is if it was passed with this 51-vote approach with the reconciliation process, it can be repealed with the exact same approach. So in theory, without a single Democratic vote, Majority Leader McConnell can simply enact this reconciliation bill. There are a couple of problems with this approach, though. First, it can't repeal Obamacare in its entirety. Due to budgetary factors, which I don't want to get into now, the reconciliation approach only repeals certain aspects of the ACA, not all of it. So while it may cut some of the spending provisions, for example, the subsidies and the Obamacare exchanges, it would leave intact the various regulations that make insurance unaffordable. So in some respects, it'd be the worst of all worlds. We'd have all the things that make insurance cheaper gone, and all the things that make insurance expensive still there. And it would actually be really counterproductive. The second reason why I think that approach is problematic is it leaves us in the exact same position we're now, except mirror image. Obamacare was enacted on a party line vote, and here it can be repealed on a party line vote. That creates a lot of animosity and leaves this bitter taste in everyone's mouth. And for any sort of healthcare system to be sustainable, which I would want it to be, it must be bipartisan. There's a second approach that could be used, which I think would be even more problematic. Specifically, the filibuster can be eliminated. There's an article in the New York Times this morning that says McConnell may be considering getting rid of the filibuster altogether. I think this is a serious risk. Yeah. As someone who generally favors limited government, the filibuster is a good thing because it needs 60% to expand the scope of federal power. Once you eliminate that, the federal government in a different administration can run roughshod. I will give the other position, though. In the event that one day we have a President Elizabeth Warren and a Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, I don't think they'll hesitate for a moment to get rid of the filibuster. So you have this sort of game of mutually assured destruction of who will blink first. So if the Republicans ever decide to get rid of the filibuster, it will be to eliminate Obamacare. I mean, that would be the thing that actually brings them forward.
So if I hear you correctly, what you're saying is if you try to repeal Obamacare under the reconciliation measure, you can only repeal parts of it. And yes. Really, they're the parts of it that people most like or that make it palatable.
Yes.
Okay. So if in thinking, though, long term about what would replace it or something, because it seems to me they really have two options now because Obamacare isn't working. And so you're either going to have more government, more Medicaid, I guess, or putting people on Medicaid or some sort of comprehensive approach, or you have a more market-centered, I would imagine, individual purchase approach. And so help us kind of think through it seems what I've heard is there is something along the lines of a more market-oriented repeal option out there or replace option.
So the entire campaign of repealing and replacing Obamacare was always very clear in the former and always very nebulous on the latter. And it's not without reason. And what I mean by this, if the Republicans were to put forward a plan in the last couple of years, it would have been savaged. Why? Because it can't possibly implement, so it's very easy to attack. Now that we actually have a legislative majority, you can actually put something forward and actually have it debated in Congress and not in MSNBC. So I think there was actually a distinct reason why Republicans withheld specifics. So Speaker Ryan has this policy, which he calls a better way, that uses certain market-based reforms to go ahead. The key choice is increasing choice. As it stands now, people have 3 or 4 options. You can buy gold, the platinum, bronze, silver, whatever plans are available, and that limits what people can do. A lot of people might want a cheaper policy. Obamacare made the decision that we don't want people having cheap policies because they may get in trouble. Well, people just saying, screw this, I'm not going to buy insurance at all. It's too expensive. Yeah. So one of the ways to reduce costs is to actually give people more choice of what's available. Another option.
So you're saying that would entail getting government out of the mandate business. and
Exactly.
letting. Okay, yeah.
It would let the market price different types of policies, and insurance companies can decide what to offer rather than being constrained. The reason why insurance is so expensive is that Obamacare imposes very strict requirements of what is covered and what cannot be covered, and that gives insurance companies very little flexibility. Another provision that's worth considering is the Medicaid expansion. And as this works now, going forward, the federal government pays roughly 90% of the cost of insuring all these additional people on Medicaid. The states foot the rest of the bill. One of the longstanding policies, Judge Buckley advanced this forever, is what's called block grants, where you simply give the state a block of money and let them do with it as they wish, rather than micromanaging how they run their federal programs. So this could be actually a different way of modifying this other aspect of Obamacare that's extremely expensive.
Okay. So thinking about I suppose you said so parts of Obamacare that have been woven in. One of which you stated was just the idea that insurance companies couldn't charge people different rates based on assessments of likelihood of care, age, all of those sorts of things. I mean, if that's true, then this makes any market-oriented approach incredibly difficult in terms of instilling that as a principle of healthcare.
Right, but it's not impossible. There are certain ways to create what are called high-risk pools, where you put these people with very serious conditions in a specific risk pool. And frankly, even if
are they just the ward of the state at that point?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Like stop treating them like regular customers.
Okay.
Because they're not. The insurance companies are complaining that you have a very small percentage of their clientele affecting a significant percentage of their costs. So even if you impose an excise tax on something just to fund these really sick people, that would be better than trying to distort the market to make everyone else pay for it through their insurance policies. There's so much, the Keynesian economics would be, fun to discuss, but a straight up tax to pay for people who are sick would be far more transparent than distorting everyone else's premiums to cover it.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. So, I mean, this is interesting. I mean, just listening to you describe all this, we go back to the halcyon days of 2010. All of these healthcare insurance companies are on board with Obamacare. Now, some of that was, I guess, intimidation, but a lot of that also was government is going to guarantee us profits here. They're going to make it work for us, and yet it hasn't worked for them. The stories coming out, large insurers fleeing Obamacare. I think Anthem now is thinking about leaving, which would be, I think, a massive blow on top of other massive blows. Why is Obamacare not working out for them? Why did the implementation process not make it profitable for the private sector?
So imagine if you run a company and the government comes to you and says, we're going to make people buy your product and we're going to subsidize it.
Yeah, so why didn't that work?
Your response, sign me up.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, the insurance companies made their Faustian pact, right? They made their deal with the devil. They were willing to go into this massive boondoggle with the supposition that people will be mandated to buy their product and it will be subsidized by the federal government. The problem is, what they didn't entail is that the demand was much lower than expected. The government forecasted as recently as 2015 that 20 million people will sign up for Obamacare. The actual number, about 10 million people. So the demand hasn't been there. Why? Because the policies are far more expensive than planned, and they're not giving people enough choice. So a lot of people are simply deciding, you know what, this is not worth my time. Even if it's subsidized, I'm not going to do it. So the insurance companies are realizing, what do we do? And they're frantically fleeing the marketplaces one after the other. And this is not inadvertent. They're simply realizing that the amount of money they're spending on these sicker and older people is making this unprofitable. I don't mean to keep harping on this point, because this is the most popular aspect of the ACA. I think it's like 80-something% popularity. People approve of it. But if you ask people, do you approve of this precondition ban if it makes your insurance more expensive, the number drops a bit. It's about 60%. If people actually understood that the reason why insurance is going up is we're covering all these sick people, I think their compassion may have a second, they may have a second awakening about their sense of compassion, because it's a significant cost for doing this.
Thinking, I mean, this seems to open us up to the ways in which Obamacare was implemented, which you know well. And the only way to implement something this comprehensive that would interact with a private market like healthcare, as large as healthcare is, would be to do it through waiver. Would be to negotiate it on the fly, dismiss certain parts of it, implement this part of it, et cetera. But is that, I mean, I guess that in a way that opened it up inevitably to this sort of fatal set of problems that they really couldn't force everyone to buy it, even though they said that they would. They really couldn't mandate all the parts that would, sort of make it profitable. That didn't really happen. So is that, I mean, am I right in thinking that, in the end, the very ways in which they tried to make it work with this rule by waiver, government by waiver, doomed Obamacare to this sort of, systemic market failure?
Richard, one of the most ironic parts of President Obama's implementation of the ACA, what I've called government by blog post.
Government by blog post. That's, I like it.
Yeah, I made up that term on a Law and Liberty blog post a couple of years ago. I wrote fittingly, and it's now been quoted in my book. It's been quoted in David Bernstein's book. It's been quoted elsewhere. But the ironic part of the government by blog post is it's actually deprived the number of people who can sign up for Obamacare. By granting all these waivers and exemptions, you've told people, well, maybe you don't need insurance. It's had the perverse effect of shrinking the risk pools, which has actually injured the insurance companies. Right? The existential crisis of keeping Obamacare alive for 1 year, 2 years, severely weakened in years 3, 4, 5, and 6. It was very short-sighted. And this is what happens when you have an executive flying by the seat of his pants, making up as he goes along, trying to live for another day, ignoring the rule of law and Congress's statutes.
So a question here, too. I mean, you're thinking about Obamacare and it being a solution to, it's interesting just to think about this, comparatively speaking, how good healthcare was in America prior to Obamacare, and this sort of public rhetoric about crisis. So Obamacare is going to fix a healthcare crisis, but yet it does so curiously by doubling up on what's already a problem in my mind, which is that we all get our healthcare through our employers, or 55 to 60% of us get our healthcare through our employers, and of course it's the third-party payment issue that distorts costs so dramatically, as opposed to having true consumer healthcare guiding and really trying to have consumers make these decisions with their own dollars. Obamacare, increases that issue, and so it doesn't really solve, in my mind, what's most at issue, which is a changing economy. We're all changing jobs, changing careers multiple times. So getting your healthcare insurance through your employer is inherently problematic in that more mobile economy, and then also the price issue, which is distorted by it. And Obamacare keeps all of those things in place. How does one, or could one, move towards divorcing healthcare from your employer and sort of opening up a cost system that's more, accurate, more efficient?
Richard, you're exactly on point. The reason why, well, not the reason why, but one of the main reasons why our insurance system is so expensive is because we get our insurance through employers. This is a historical artifact. Starting with World War II, the tax code existed such that health insurance benefits were not taxed. Labor unions realized that, okay, we're going to negotiate for higher benefit packages instead of higher salaries. That way we avoid tax treatment. As a result, one of the biggest forms of compensation people have today is their insurance. If you're a union employee or a government employee, or even at my own law school, I pay very little for my health care, and that's a contribution my employer makes that's not taxed. This is an awful way of compensating people because it creates distortions. I would much rather have this money in my pocket that I can spend as I choose than have an insurance policy that, frankly, I don't use very much. I'm fairly young, and thankfully, thank God, I'm healthy. The flip side to this, though, is if we actually want to get people off their employer-provided care, a lot of people would lose the plans they like. The irony is the exact thing Obama promised is inconsistent with moving people off the plans they like. In fact, one of the key constraints in the Affordable Care Act to get people off their generous employer plans was the Cadillac tax. This was a 40% excise tax on insurance policies that employers may provide.
If they waive for unions, right?
Oh my God, this would have been a nightmare for the unions because basically it makes their entire these platinum-plated plans go away. These were Cadillac plans. So of course, no one expected this to go into effect. Last year, Democrats and Republicans agreed to delay it 2 years. Okay, that 2-year delay will become a perpetual delay. It will never go into effect. So even the one thing Obamacare that was actually good, constraining costs, right? The Democrats jettisoned. So there's simply no sense of sacrifice needed to accomplish what they wanted to. So I keep harping this point. We have this massive new entitlement, but people aren't willing to sacrifice to pay for it. Those two goals are inconsistent.
So we've got, just with the private sector, we've got a tremendous exit cost, which you're right. Employer-provided healthcare insurance is really good for most people. And then so now you have to realize these costs on your own. I suppose favorable tax treatment could also be offered to consumer healthcare plans and taken away from employers. Maybe that would be a way to cash it out. But yeah, so people are now responsible for something directly they haven't been in the past. Although maybe, I mean, it's funny, I have the high deductible healthcare with an HSA. We're slowly already conditioning people to that reality, which would be a good thing if we are, as I say, going to try and move in some way more towards a market-oriented approach rather than a government healthcare approach. Thinking about though this government by blog post, as you mentioned, or Richard Epstein's great phrase, government by waiver. The question that comes to mind: did Obamacare reveal to Americans, like no other way, the just sheer use of executive power in our country, the ways in which it governs us, constrains us? And Obamacare, because healthcare was so important, it's so important to Obama, his legacy, to, just in general, to progressivism and to the way progressivism thinks of constitutionalism in this sort of progressive, historicist way of we're laying down new milestones for equality. And healthcare was always a big milestone that had to be laid. Therefore, nothing could be left undone to achieve it, including complete unlawful uses of power. So one question that emerges, I think, is an ultimate legacy of Obamacare is waking Americans up to this, decades-long use of executive power, now on the domestic side that is without constraint.
I don't think you can quote progressivism without talking about Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson famously said, I have no need for a constitution. At least he was honest about it. Yeah. I sincerely think that Barack Obama does not believe that. He's a former constitutional law professor. He believes that he's following the Constitution, but he has a very warped sense of what it requires and what it permits. And he has, more than any of his predecessors, adopted this sense of benevolent suspension, that when the law is operating in a fashion that I don't like, I can simply decline to enforce it. And they can dress this up however they want: prosecutorial discretion, enforcement waivers, whatever you want to call it. But at bottom, he didn't enforce the individual mandate because that would have required people losing their insurance. He didn't enforce the employer mandate because that would have required businesses to have to cut workers. He didn't enforce the strict requirements of the Obamacare mandate and how policy must be structured because then people have been angry at him. All these things to avoid unpopular decisions, he simply waived laws he didn't like. It had the perverse effect of actually wounding Obamacare, but set really dangerous precedents for executive power. And I'll admit, Richard, in the past 72 hours or so, I've had a bit of schadenfreude watching all these progressive scholars freak out that now Donald J. Trump, who I think is absolutely insane, how Donald Trump can now use the powers of Barack Obama, the same pen and phone, right? Trump has a Sharpie and Twitter. The same sort of power that Obama has used will now be in the hands of Donald J. Trump. I've had complete schadenfreude of watching these people flip around the issues. If nothing else, my scholarship on skepticism of the administrative state will probably become a lot more popular. I'll probably get a lot more invitations to speak at faculty lounges now, if nothing else. But I've been warning about this for some time, and well, now we'll see what happens.
No. I mean, the short-sightedness during the Obama administration was incredible. I suppose the question also here are parts that were never implemented, but I think were crucial to the cost containment. The Independent Payments Advisory Board. What happened there?
Okay, IPAB. This is a this was a so-called. If you remember, Sarah Palin made some news a couple of years ago, and she called it the death panels.
Yeah.
Right. This, to summarize, is a board that can make decisions about how much money is available for healthcare planning. It's a board that cannot be checked by anyone. Not even God himself can stop this board, except by maybe a bolt of lightning. It cannot be repealed except for a brief period. I think maybe next year or the year after, and I think actually may be repealed now. Now that both houses of Congress are presumably Republican. But this was the idea that the budgeting and rationing of medicine, according to the Obamacare central planners, should not be subject to the political process. This is the absolute height of arrogance, because they wanted to solidify this for perpetuity. I think now, especially in the last 72 hours or so, there's been this recognition that, we screwed up, right?
Yeah.
We tried to do this on a straight party line vote. It is now massively unpopular. It's not working. And that guy from Midtown Manhattan's about to destroy it. And there's this stunning recognition that, whoops, we screwed up.
I always thought, Sarah Palin said death panels, and she was widely mocked and something of an exaggeration. But she wasn't too far off, was she? And in the ways in which it would ultimately argue. And I think in everyone's mind are stories I've heard of how Canadian healthcare operates, particularly for those at the end of life. Where they just don't treat you to save costs. And it's a utilitarian rationale. What are you going to offer for the economy if we did treat you? So I don't know. What do you think?
So yeah, exactly. This is about end of life planning, right? Do you give an old person chemotherapy? Do you give them a pain pill? And the fact of the matter is, in other socialist nations, that is a decision a government bureaucrat makes when deciding how to give treatment. Fortunately, in the United States, we have private insurance, and you can not do that, and you can actually pay for your own treatment. But once we go to the sort of government-run health insurance, you don't have that choice, right? You can't go to a doctor and say, I'd like to pay you cash. They'll say, well, we don't accept cash. Thank you. Go sign up for government insurance. So although Palin's a euphemism probably wasn't exactly on point, the sentiment, I think, was also. Oh, sorry.
Your dog's a Palin fan, Josh.
I think my dog is afraid of doggy care.
Okay.
And she's very well. This is actually not the first time my dog's popped up on podcasts. So she has a block following it.
She has a cameo. Yeah. It was interesting. Also, you say so. Even private insurers have to deal with the rationing of care, but I suppose there's also competition also involved there, and other sorts of limits and checks on what they're going to do versus monopoly power of government. So a fitting part of your book also is the religious liberty question that Obamacare introduced. And we also, it's so interesting now to sort of think about the rise of a candidate like Donald Trump and the rise of supporters behind him, things in which woke this sort of, or stirred the hornet's nest. I think one of them was the contraceptive mandate. And just the question in my mind that is, why was the administration not willing to just leave Little Sisters of the Poor alone, leave Notre Dame alone, leave various religious nonprofits alone? Why did it so want to bring them into the dragnet of paying ultimately for abortifacients?
The only word I can use is arrogance. It's a word I keep coming back to. This actually was not a monolithic position. Indeed, in the early debates, a number of people who actually are religious in the White House, Joe Biden, Joe McDonough, and others actually urged the president to, craft a much broader religious exemption. They were outvoted. And I think there was a strong sense that, and I believe this firmly, they don't believe that making someone pay for contraceptive is sinful. Yeah. They believe only if you're making them take it themselves, it's sinful. And I'll give you a crazy example I discuss in this book. The first round of accommodations that were released, this is back in August of 2013, or maybe it was even 11, I'm drawing a blank here, but the very first round of accommodations worked like this. If you were a house of worship, you were generally exempt from Obamacare's mandate. However, if you were a house of worship that did not primarily serve people of the same faith, you were not exempt. So imagine if you have a church that operates a soup kitchen and you don't check baptismal certificates at the door. You are now not religious enough for the Obamacare exemption, and you are subject to the mandate. This was their first approach. This was their, they thought this would make people happy. This blew up in their face. You had Cardinal Dolan basically yelling at the president about this. Then they said, okay, fine, we'll exempt all houses of worship, even if they don't, limit themselves to people of their own faith. But I want to dwell on that point for a second. This is the liberal mantra of religion, that you can have your religion so long as you're amongst yourselves. The second you open up to the public, It doesn't matter. And that, I think, is really emblematic of a broader issue. This wasn't a mistake. This was their philosophy. What they perhaps didn't anticipate was how there would be blowback to it. So even to this day, they don't want to exempt the Little Sisters of the Poor because they think that it's too burdensome for their employees to get birth control.
Yeah.
I have a surprise for those people. I hope, or suspect that the Trump administration will have a different perspective on this, and very well may simply say, "Okay, we're going to exempt the Little Sisters."
Yeah. Well, you point out in your book, state governments had requirements imposing contraceptive coverage and for insurers operating within their states, but they didn't hesitate to exempt a lot of religious nonprofits, and that was somehow lost here. And Obama thinking, well, we're not doing anything that's not already happening in a lot of states, but yeah, you kind of are.
Well, it's actually even worse than that, Richard. So, for example, California had one of the toughest mandates in the country that required basically all religious charities to pay not only for birth control but surgical abortions, right?
Yeah.
So if you're a religious charity, I think it was like the Catholic Charities of Sacramento is one of the plaintiffs. They were bound to pay for abortions for their employees. However, because of something called preemption, right? If they have a certain type of insurance plan, federal law basically nullifies state law. So even before Obamacare, yeah, exactly. It's called self-insurance. So even before Obamacare, if you were in California, you can get away from the state law mandate by this federal safe harbor. Obamacare eliminated that without a single shred of evidence that Congress ever even considered it. There's so much that went on in Congress that was never discussed. And they simply said, oh, well, Nancy Pelosi, we'll pass the bill and we'll find out what's in it later. And they meant that sincerely. This thing is truly a legislative abomination, no pun intended. And the difficult choices that have to be made were not made by Congress, but were made by these unelected bureaucrats.
Well, it seems to me one is I kind of draw a connection with the Hosanna Tabor case, which is also a breathtaking display of arrogance towards religious liberty, whereby, as you know, the Obama administration essentially took the position that the ministerial exception doctrine for churches that exempts them from federal civil rights law should be thrown out. And the only sort of protections churches would get in hiring and firing their ministers would be sort of freedom of association rules, and more or less. And, that's pretty breathtaking if you think about it. But I think, the question would be, why was there no one inside the Department of Justice or, whoever was discussing the rationale here who sort of raised a red flag about this approach? And my only thought there is there's just no respect for religion, period, outside of the narrow congregational limits, freedom of worship, as we always hear, particularly Hillary Clinton says freedom of worship. And then if you apply that to the contraceptive mandate, I suppose there's also the principle, our constitutional principle in their mind at stake, which is we can't give independent recognition here to religion. To do so sort of undermines this comprehensive secular approach that we want to take overall with regard to public policy.
Richard, you're exactly on point. I make this point in Unraveled. The position in Hosanna Tabor is identical to the position in the first round of the accommodation. In fact, I think they were issued within a couple of weeks of each other, the governance brief in Hosanna Tabor and the Obama contraceptive mandate. The position is this: so long as you're among people of your own faith, fine, you can worship with your people. But the second you open up beyond that, you don't get anything special, right? You lack that solicitude, and I think it's an ignorant position of the centrality of religion in our constitutional order, but I think also reflects the fact that probably most of the people in the administration simply lack that understanding of faith. I mean, I work in the academy. Law professors have a generally hostile view of religion when it comes to various social justice issues, and there's no bones about it. I don't know if maybe there was Joe Biden and McDonough screaming, saying, hey, you guys, think about what you're doing to the nuns here. But those sound voices were overruled. And it's stunning that it took them several rounds of accommodations to even get to the point where the nuns didn't have to pay for it. So now, as it stands, the nuns don't have to pay for it, but you simply have to use their insurance policy to provide products that they deem abortifacients.
Yeah. So, yeah, I didn't know what the final accommodation was for Little Sisters of the Poor, because I know they had been told to work it out amongst themselves. And so that's interesting.
Well, it's complicated for the Little Sisters. I keep saying the nuns because it's easy, but the Little Sisters have a very specific type of plan called a church plan. Church plans are generally exempt from ERISA by the way they're structured. So the nuns, this is actually weird. The nuns can't be forced to provide the contraceptives, but the government won't release them from the mandate. So, in other words, the government's still asking for them to sign this piece of paper, sign this document, even though, as a result of signing this document, women won't get any birth control. The nuns insist that signing this document makes them complicit in sin. So it's this weird sense that they're even putting the nuns through these paces, even though the nuns can't be forced to actually comply. I suspect and I hope that the next administration will simply create a broad exemption.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be at the cost of women. Women can still get it through a separate plan. The government can say, okay, Aetna or okay, Blue Cross Blue Shield, create a separate contraceptive card for these two employees, the same way you have a prescription drug card or a dental card, and let them use this to buy birth control and let them use this to get treatment for birth control. Would it be more burdensome for the women? Yes, and I'll be frank, it would. They may have some problems when they're going to the doctor that switch cards. They may have some problems administrating different accounts. But the fact of the matter is they'll get the coverage and the religious liberty will be protected. And then this case goes away from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not as if it's not as if ex ante that was actually so burdensome to begin with, but in any event, the political reality. Question, just more broadly for you and thinking about the lawsuits that challenged Obamacare, which you were involved in. So two main lawsuits, obviously, one challenging the mandate and then the other one more statutory interpretation on the federal exchanges. Think about, I guess I'm kind of thinking like, did the lawsuits backfire or did they awaken the public? Overall, did they, strangely enough, force more public engagement and public argument, even though two precedents were laid down at the Supreme Court in favor of Obamacare?
So I think the issue with the litigation, it's been a very bittersweet experience. And what do I mean by that? I think in several cases the challengers had some really good arguments.
Yeah.
In NFIB v. Sebelius, the idea that Congress can't make you buy a commercial product, I think that's right.
Yeah.
In King v. Burwell, the idea that the phrase established by the states is best understood to mean established by the states. That is, a state-run exchange can give you subsidies, but not a federal exchange. I think that's also a sound construction. But the Chief Justice, who seems to break my heart every June without fail, has seemed to put on his plate this sense that the Affordable Care Act is untouchable, that it's of this super, super duper status that is beyond the reach of the federal courts. In Justice Scalia's words, in sort of his last dissents, he wrote that we should call this law SCOTUS care instead of Obamacare.
Yeah. That
all the usual rules about the Affordable Care Act, all the usual rules of statutory interpretation and constitutional construction go out the window when it involves Obamacare. And for these reasons, the court has done bizarre things to the ACA. On the flip side, if the chief had struck down Obamacare in 2012, I'd have a lot less to write about. So I guess I personally profit from it. Although for the sake of our constitutional republic, I would gladly forfeit this second book for a do-over in NFIB Sebelius. Yeah,
it's interesting. We talk about legacies of Obamacare. One of those legacies is really the reputation, ultimately, of Justice John Roberts. Throughout across the political spectrum.
Yeah, I think the Chief Justice. I really do think the Chief Justice has established his perspective that the ACA is not going to be destroyed by the courts, but by Congress. And maybe now he'll get his wish.
Yeah, it's interesting too. I think this is something that my own learning process coming during the Obama administration, which has made me appreciate and go back and even rereading our founding political thought to think about self-government and republicanism, because it seems more than ever it's the case. Ultimately, no one in the executive branch is going to save us, or a judicial branch official is going to save us. It's got to be something that even chastening the administrative state isn't going to happen, I think, through the federal judiciary by eliminating Chevron or something like that. It really is going to be Congress reclaiming its own authority. But that really brings us back to the inception point of Obamacare, which is this wasn't self-government and deliberation. This was really a football pile and move it forward and score a touchdown. I remember watching the day it was passed in 2010. I was on spring break with my kids and watched the coverage the entire day. And very clearly, this was this was something like a majority without any regard for even understanding the statute, but pass it. So something there fundamentally broken, which has continued to haunt the Obama administration also.
Yeah, I return to this word over and over again, but arrogance. The idea was, let's pass this now in 2010
and fix it
on a straight party line vote, and magically everyone will fall in line and suddenly support Obamacare. That was such an arrogant and naive decision, And as history turns out, President Obama, it seems, has presided over the decimation of the Democratic Party. Every year he's in office, his party lost power, and now his signature achievement has become a millstone, which is likely to be, gutted in the next couple months. So this idea that let's pass stuff now and worry about it later was so stupid. I don't like using the word stupid, but it was very ignorant to actually do that. And now we're stuck in this position that the ACA is not operating. A lot of people are unhappy. Who the hell knows what Paul Ryan has cooked up to replace it with? He hasn't really said. But President Obama should be very introspective about how he did things and the way he did it. Look at some of the other bills passed in the 20th century, the Civil Rights Act, the Social Security Act, Americans with Disabilities Act. These all were passed with bipartisan support, and they're sustainable. For healthcare law to be sustainable, it has to be bipartisan. And I'm going to make this point. People won't be happy with me, but repealing it on a straight party line vote would be a mistake. It would be a mistake.
I agree.
Position. I mean, you can either nuke the filibuster, which I think would be dangerous, or you could use a reconciliation process, would be incomplete. But at bottom, even if you get rid of chunks of Obamacare with 51 votes in the Senate, you'll still have this situation where half the country hates it. You need to have bipartisanship to make something this momentous work.
But I think it's interesting, just the political analysis. You've got all these Democratic senators up, many from red states or battleground states in 2018. Perhaps they're your votes right there, provided it's a replace package that somehow they can get their hands around. A question for you, just here at the end. Overall, the statute, as I said at the beginning of our interview, like no one else. What have you learned? What has it taught you? How has it shaped your own thinking about government and law?
I think more than anything else, this experience has taught me the arrogance of central planning. We've read Hayek, right? We read our great thinkers. Obamacare is a case study in the fatal conceit. The idea that these people, these Jonathan Grubers, these geniuses, can be so smart that they control the market with the right level of subsidies and the right level of regulations and the right level of this and the right level of that. They can, with their models, finesse the market in just the right way to make this amazing machine work. Come on, right? I don't need to read a Hayek graphic novel to know this won't work, and indeed it hasn't. And remarkably, their solution to this problem was more government central planning. They said, let's have a public option. One of the few good things of a Donald Trump presidency is we won't get that, at least now. Maybe we'll later. But the idea of giving these geniuses the keys when they've already wrecked the car is stunning. So if nothing else, there should be an indictment on the ability of central planners and perhaps a reinvigoration of the importance of markets to handle these sorts of things, not government planning.
Josh, thank you so much for your time today. We've been talking with Josh Blackman, the author of the new book, Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. Thank you so much.
Richard, thank you so much.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.